Hello everyone and welcome back to Purple Heart Stories. We've got another gripping tale for you today, so settle in and enjoy. Chapter 1, Omen. Sometimes the most terrifying storms begin with just a ripple on the water. Robert Caulfield knew that better than most. 15 years in the Navy had taught him to read the sea like an open book. Now, as the lighthouse keeper on Blue Point Island, he kept watch, though of a different kind. And his wife, Emily, devoted her life to studying those who sang their ancient songs in the depths off their island's shores. They were happy here, him, her, and his mother, Margaret, until a young scientist and businessman with a picture-perfect smile and a predator's eyes stepped onto their shore. But James Bright was still a few hours away, and those hours ticked by like sand in the old clock in the lighthouse's parlor, counting down the last moments of their old life. Robert woke up with a pain in his leg. The old wound always ached before bad weather. A darned piece of shrapnel had been lodged there ever since his destroyer had hit a mine in the Persian Gulf. He lost 3 of his crew that day, and the memory of them haunted him every night when the sea got especially rough. Like tonight, he thought, the water was just like that, oily black with whitecaps like teeth bared in a ghastly grin. He limped over to the window. Emily wasn't there. She always went out for her dawn observations, no matter the weather. That was her. His wife, obsessed with her whales, ready to get soaked for hours with her binoculars and notebook. Sometimes Robert thought she understood those massive creatures better than she understood people. Maybe that was why she'd married him. There was something of the whale in him too, a quiet steadiness and a devotion to the chosen course. The lighthouse creaked in the rising wind. Robert went up to the watchroom, where everything was in its proper place. He kept the same order here as he had on the bridge of his last ship. The lenses were polished to a shine, last night, like every night for the past 5 years. The logbook open on a fresh page. The first rays of sun barely poked through the heavy clouds when he saw them at the whales. They were moving strangely, not at all as they usually did. Robert had watched these majestic creatures many times. They were part of his morning routine, like a strong cup of coffee and a fresh entry in the log. But today something was off. The humpbacks, normally so deliberate and predictable, were darting around like spooked horses. There were 7, diving deep and then surfacing again like they were trying to get away from something. Margaret, his mother, came upstairs, carrying a thermos of coffee. At 65, she maintained the posture and manner of the successful Boston lawyer she had been before her husband's death. Robert remembered the day she appeared at the lighthouse door with a single suitcase and said, "Son, I can't live in the city anymore. The sea took your father. Now it has to take care of me." Since then, she had become an integral part of their small world, bringing her wisdom and insight with her. "Something's wrong with the whales," she said, without even looking at the sea. Margaret always knew, just knew that was all. At that moment, the door downstairs slammed. Emily was back, and the hurriedness of her steps on the stairs told them something important had happened. She burst into the room, her red hair disheveled from the wind, her eyes burning with the special fire that only appeared when she made a significant discovery. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold morning air, and she clutched a tattered notebook in a waterproof cover, her constant companion. "Robert, Margaret, you won't believe it," she gasped, catching her breath. "The whales are changing their migration route. All my records from the last week confirm it. They're moving away from something in the east. Something's scaring them. Something's scaring them," Robert's mind echoed. Like back in the Gulf, when the dolphins suddenly disappeared the day before the enemy torpedo boats showed up. The sky continued to darken. The waves were getting higher. The wind was picking up, bringing with it the smell of an approaching storm. Robert reached for his binoculars, his hand moving from habit and then froze. A mile from the shore, a small research vessel was pitching and rolling, clearly struggling with the weather. They're headed straight for the reef. It'll tear them to pieces, Emily exclaimed, having spotted the vessel too. The reefs off Blue Point were treacherous. They lurked beneath the water like hidden predators, ready to rip open the hull of any ship that dared come too close. Through the increasing roar of the wind came a distress signal. Robert was already heading down the stairs, wincing at the pain in his leg. The old reflexes kicked in instantly. No matter how much his shot-up leg hurt, duty came first. "I'm coming with you," Emily called out. "No," he snapped. "Margaret, contact the Coast Guard." "Emily, keep the radio." The rescue operation lasted almost 2 hours. When Robert finally returned, they all gathered in the lighthouse's parlor. The fire crackled in the fireplace, cups of hot tea steamed on the table, and in an armchair sat the rescued man, a young man with movie star looks and the manners of a born aristocrat. "Dr. James Bright," he introduced himself, radiating charm like a lighthouse beacon. "From the Oceanographic Institute. I'm here because of your research, Mrs. Caulfield. I'm particularly interested in your data on whale migration and deep current systems." Margaret, sitting in her favorite chair by the fireplace, frowned almost imperceptibly. 30 years of law practice had taught her to recognize a phony voice, and something in Bright's tone grated on her like a splinter. She didn't know, not yet, that this splinter would, within a few weeks, turn into a knife aimed at the heart of their family. Outside, the storm raged, and the whales had already gone deep, taking their worries with them. And in the cozy parlor of the Blue Point Island Lighthouse, a story began that would change their lives forever. A story of love and betrayal, of duty and temptation, of how easy it is to lose yourself and how hard it is to find your way home. Chapter 2: Enchantment. A week had passed since that stormy morning when James Bright appeared on their island. A week that had quietly changed the way of life of the lighthouse inhabitants, like a wave subtly eroding the coastal rocks. Emily was spending more and more time in her research lab, set up in an old fishing hut by the dock, and Robert was staring at the horizon for longer, as if trying to see signs of a coming storm. Sailors know that the most dangerous storms don't come with thunder and roar. They sneak in on soft cat paws, deceptively gentle until it's too late. "Take a look at this data, Emily." Bright's voice was like velvet, sandpaper wrapped in silk. He leaned over the computer, his shoulder almost touching hers. Charts of migrations, temperature maps, sonar data flashed on the screen. "We're on the verge of a major breakthrough. Your observations from the past few years. It's the missing piece of the puzzle." Emily could feel his breath on her cheek, the faint scent of expensive cologne. James was so different from the people around here, polished smooth like beach pebbles, shining with scientific degrees and society manners. Later, much later, she would realize that pebbles became smooth because the sea had battered them against the rocks for centuries, washing away all the living things. "See!" His fingers flew across the keyboard, opening new data windows. "If you overlay your records of whale behavior on the deep current map." "Amazing! Do you realize what this means?" Of course, she understood. 15 years of observations, endless hours at sea in all kinds of weather, thousands of notes in waterlogged notebooks. All of it was suddenly taking on a new meaning in the light of his theories. Robert didn't notice the changes in his wife right away. At first, they were small things. A cold dinner, a forgotten kettle on the stove, an unread book on the bedside table, the very one she used to reread every year on their anniversary. Then, she started coming back later and later, with her eyes shining and a distracted smile. "James showed me amazing modeling results," she would say, waving her hands as she had in the early years of their relationship. "Can you imagine? We can prove the connection between changes in whale behavior and global oceanic processes. Robert remembered a different kind of enthusiasm in her voice when she first saw the lighthouse, when they were planning their life here, when they dreamed of a future that now seemed so distant. Margaret watched what was happening with the wariness of an old guard dog. Her lawyer's instinct, honed over years of dealing with human weaknesses and vices, was sounding the alarm. One evening, passing by the lab late at night, she saw Bright, thinking no one was watching, photographing the documents on Emily's desk. "Just making copies for the Institute," he explained the next day with a disarming smile. "Bureaucracy, you know. Everything has to be documented." The smile was perfect, too perfect, like a tombstone on a fresh grave. The first serious argument between Robert and Emily happened on Friday evening when she missed their traditional family dinner. "You're spending too much time with this Bright guy," Robert said, trying to keep his voice even. "Don't start," she snapped. "This is important research, maybe the most important in my career. Why can't you be happy for me? Because something doesn't feel right here?" He paused, choosing his words. "I've seen a lot of storms, Emily, and right now I feel a big one coming." She laughed, but there was an unfamiliar note in her laughter. "You're just jealous. James is a brilliant scientist. He has connections to the best research centers in the world. He can help my work get recognition." "And are you sure that it's just about work?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. Emily froze, as if she'd been slapped. Then she turned and left, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. That night, Robert stood for a long time on the lighthouse deck, watching the lights in the lab by the dock. There, leaning over the computer, Emily and Bright were examining some data. Their silhouettes occasionally flashed in the window, too close for mere professional contact. "He's playing on her ambitions." Margaret's voice made him flinch. He hadn't heard his mother come upstairs. "I've seen this before. Smart women are especially vulnerable to flattery disguised as professional recognition." Robert was silent. He knew his mother was rarely wrong about people, and he also knew that there was nothing he could do yet. Only watch as his wife grew more and more distant from him, enchanted by the glitter of scientific fame and promises of recognition. The light went out in the lab by the dock. A few minutes later, two figures came outside, and Emily's voice, unusually bright, echoed over the quiet harbor. "That's incredible, James. Can we really prove it?" "With your data, absolutely," Bright replied. "You have no idea how important your research is. Could change everything." Chapter 3. Suspicions. Margaret Caulfield had spent 30 years looking for the devil in the details of legal documents. She knew that the most important things were always hidden in the footnotes, in small print, in the careless wording that most people skipped over. That's why she wasn't asleep that night, going over and over the copies of the research permits that Bright had carelessly left on the kitchen table. Did he leave them there by accident? In her experience, there were no accidents. Just like there were no accidental currents in the ocean. Everything followed certain laws. You just had to know where to look. Something was wrong with these documents. The seals were in place, the signatures looked perfect, but something sinister was hidden between the lines, like the reefs under the smooth surface of the water. "Good Lord," Margaret whispered, putting on her glasses to get a better look at the small print. "There it is." Meanwhile, Robert was sitting in his old study, set up in one of the lighthouse rooms, having a not-so-official radio conversation. The old Army transmitter, retired after his discharge, quietly hissed and crackled. "Jack? Jack Harris? It's Bob Caulfield. Yeah, the one from the Persian Gulf. Listen, I need a favor. Can you run a background check on a guy? James Bright, from the Oceanographic Institute." He and Jack had served together on a destroyer back in the day. Jack was now working in security for a big corporation, and his access to databases was, let's just say, wider than the official channels. And in the lab by the dock, Emily and Bright were leaning over new sonar data. Strange shadows were dancing on the computer screen, unusual silhouettes of large marine creatures for those waters. This can't be an ordinary school. Emily tapped nervously on the table with a pencil. The movement patterns are different, and the sizes. What if it's them? Bright moved closer, his breath tickling her ear. The ones thought to be extinct? Her heart skipped a beat. An extinct species of whale here, off their island? This would be the discovery of the century, her name etched in scientific history forever. The night was moonless. They went out to sea on a small boat that Bright had rented for night observations. The waves gently rocked the vessel. The stars reflected in the dark water, creating an illusion of infinity, as if they were sailing not on the ocean, but among the constellations. "Look," Bright whispered, pointing to the flickering screen of the sonar. "They're right beneath us." Emily held her breath. At that moment, singing came from the depths, ancient, inhumanly beautiful. The whales were communicating with each other, and there was a note of anxiety in their song that she had never heard before. Incredible! Bright moved even closer. In the dark, his eyes shone strangely. "Do you realize that we're making history right now?" His hand fell on her shoulder, and Emily suddenly realized she didn't want to pull away. Here, in the middle of the night ocean, reality seemed as fragile as sea mist. His lips were getting closer. That night on the boat, their relationship went beyond just professional collaboration. Completely. Later, she would remember that moment over and over, trying to understand when exactly she had crossed the line. In the lighthouse, Margaret finally found what she was looking for. Hidden between the lines of legal wording was the right to conduct preparatory work to assess the possibility of industrial use of the water area. A seemingly innocent phrase, but she knew what those words meant in the language of corporate lawyers. She went down to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and stopped at the window. A light was twinkling in the darkness of the Ocean Bright's boat. There, on board, her niece-in-law, it seemed, had lost herself in a dangerous game with a man whose true intentions were becoming clearer. Robert wasn't asleep either. Jack had sent the first results of the background check, and they were troubling. Bright did indeed work at the Oceanographic Institute, but his research was funded through a complex network of shell companies. And all the threads led to one source, Pacific Maritime Holdings, a company that was more interested in money than in science. Big money. "Be careful, Bob," Jack had warned. "Those guys don't like anyone sticking their nose in their business. They have people everywhere, in the government, in academia, even in the Coast Guard." In the morning, Margaret tried to talk to her son. She found him on the observation deck. He was watching Bright's boat returning to the harbor. Emily was standing on the deck, her red hair blowing in the morning wind. Even from a distance, you could tell how she was laughing at something Bright had said. "Son," Margaret began, handing him the documents. "You need to see this." But before she could finish, Emily's excited voice called up from below. "Robert! Margaret! Come down! Quick! We have amazing news." At that moment, none of them knew that this news would be the beginning of the end of their normal lives. Like any sailor would say, the calm before the storm is always particularly deceptive. Chapter 4. The Truth. The truth is like the tide, you can hold it back for a while, but sooner or later it will engulf the shore completely. Robert Caulfield learned that at dawn when the Army transmitter buzzed, and Jack Harris's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence of the lighthouse. Some news is better received standing up, like a gunshot or a blow to the gut. If you're going down, it's better to at least fall from your own height. "Bob, are you sitting down?" "You better sit down." The old friend's voice sounded strained. I've dug up some stuff on your Bright and his employers. It's way more serious than we thought. Pacific Maritime Holdings. Robert remembered that company 3 years ago. They had built a deep-water port on the Oregon coast. Local fishermen said that after that, the fish disappeared and the whales and dolphins stopped coming to the bay. Environmentalists protested, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of bulldozers and the clinking of coins. They're planning the same thing here, Bob. A tanker terminal, port facilities, an industrial zone. And all of it will be covered in a film of oil and fuel. Your island is the perfect spot. Deep water, a sheltered bay, a minimum of local residents. Robert watched as the first rays of sun painted the ocean blood red. Red sky at morning, sailor's warning. The old saying had never seemed so appropriate. And Bright? He asked, although he already knew the answer. He's their man. Specializes in, let's say, preparing the territory. Finds the weak spots, gets into people's trust. He has 3 ports and 2 destroyed nature reserves under his belt. And no real scientific research. Downstairs, the door slammed. Emily was back from another night of observation. Her steps on the stairs sounded light, almost dancing. She'd been happy the last few days, too happy. Robert went down to the kitchen, where Margaret was already making breakfast. One look at his face was enough for her to understand. It was time to act. I found the documents on the construction plans. She took a folder from under a pile of cookbooks. They're not even hiding it that much. They're just using terms that a normal person won't understand without a law dictionary. Emily entered the kitchen, humming something to herself. Her cheeks were flushed from the morning air, her eyes sparkling. Robert felt his heart clench. He knew he was about to shatter her happy world to pieces. We need to talk. His voice sounded hoarser than he intended. Sure, she smiled, taking a cup from the cupboard. James showed me amazing modeling results. We can publish my research paper in. James Bright is not who he says he is. The cup froze halfway to the table. Emily slowly turned to her husband. What are you talking about? He works for Pacific Maritime Holdings. All this, his research, the interest in your work, it's all a cover. They are planning to build a port for cargo tankers here. Emily laughed, but a little uncertainly. That's just ridiculous. Nonsense. You're just jealous. James is a respected scientist who has never published a single scientific work. Robert spread out the printouts that Jack had sent. But he has extensive experience in destroying coastal ecosystems. I don't believe it. But her voice trembled. He showed me his research, forgeries. Margaret put the folder with the documents in front of her. Just like these permits. Look, right here and here, veiled terms about the industrial use of the area. Emily sat down, as if her legs had given way. She went through the documents, and the color slowly drained from her face. No, she whispered. No, no, no. At that moment, her phone rang. Bright's name was displayed on the screen. Emily. His voice sounded excited and joyful. I have amazing news. The Institute is ready to publish our joint research in the next issue of Oceanographic Review. It's a breakthrough. We need to meet, discuss the details. She looked at her husband, then at the documents, then back at the phone. Fear was swimming in her eyes, the fear of a person who suddenly realized that she had been walking on thin ice and now hears the first treacherous cracking under her feet. And besides all of this, she couldn't simply erase the night before on that boat from her life. I'll call you back. Her voice was hoarse. In the silence that followed, the sound of the waves breaking against the rocks below could be heard. Somewhere in the distance, seagulls were crying, their cries sounding like wails. It's all my work, Emily whispered. My research, 15 years of observation. So, he just used me, used us all. Margaret corrected her gently. But the game isn't over yet. At that moment, Bright's boat could be seen approaching the dock through the window. He was walking up the path to the lighthouse, fit, confident, with his usual smile on his face. A man who was used to getting what he wanted. Some people are like sharks. They never stop moving, they never get full, and they never feel regret. But even sharks sometimes get caught in the nets of experienced fishermen. Chapter 5 Choice. They say that before making the most important decision in your life, you need to listen to your heart. But what do you do if your heart is torn between truth and lies, between duty and temptation? Emily Caulfield found the answer to that question that gray morning when the sea brought her a final gift. The gifts of the sea don't always come wrapped in pretty packaging. Sometimes they come in the form of a choice between two equally painful paths. She went out to sea before dawn, alone for the first time in weeks without Bright's company. Her small boat glided over the waves like a ghost, and pieces of yesterday's conversation with Robert spun in her head. The documents he had shown her burned her memory like acid. The first ray of sun had just touched the horizon when she saw them. At first, it was just a splash unusual, unlike the normal movements of whales. Then another one, and another one. "My God!" Emily whispered, grabbing her camera. They appeared from the depths like ancient deities, huge, majestic, unlike any known species. Their skin shone silver in the morning light, and the markings on their backs formed a pattern that she had only seen before in old engravings. There are moments of absolute clarity when all doubts disappear, like fog under the morning sun. This was exactly such a moment. Her hands trembling, she turned on the recording equipment. Every splash, every breath, every movement of the giant bodies. Everything was recorded on camera. The species of whale thought to be extinct was here, right in front of her, and it changed everything. Returning to the lab, she locked the door and plunged into analyzing the data. The recordings confirmed her hunch. It was them, the ancient species thought to have disappeared more than half a century ago. Her phone vibrated. A text from Bright. "Where are you? We need to meet. Urgently." Emily looked at the computer screen where the footage of the silver giants was frozen, then at the phone. For the first time in a long time, she saw the situation with crystal clarity. Bright arrived an hour later. He entered the lab with his usual confident gait, but something in his eyes was different, something predatory. "You were at sea this morning." Not a question, a statement. "Yes, and you found something." She hesitated. "Nothing special. Routine observations." His smile grew wider, but his eyes remained cold. "Come on, Emily. I saw your boat in that part of the bay where whales don't normally go. And your equipment recorded something for at least 2 hours." He moved closer, putting his hands on her shoulders, a gesture that used to make her heart race, but now only evoked disgust and alarm. "You know, the corporation is ready to offer you something special." His voice became soft, enveloping. "The position of director of the environmental program. A 7-figure contract. International recognition. And in return? In return, you'll become the face of our project. Tell the world how we're taking care of the environment, how modern technology can coexist with nature. And these whales." His fingers tightened slightly on her shoulders. "What whales, Emily? You didn't see anything this morning. And if you did, a scientist's reputation is a fragile thing, especially when evidence of data tampering in previous studies comes to light." The threat was clear. Emily felt nauseous. At that moment, the sound of working engines came from the sea. A large ship was entering the bay, not a fishing vessel, something much more serious. "Ah, our specialists have arrived." Bright went to the window. "Preliminary seabed surveys. A formality, really. In a year, there will be a modern deepwater port here." Progress cannot be stopped, Emily. She watched as the huge ship dropped anchor in the bay. Equipment for deep drilling could be seen on board. Give me time to think, honey. Her voice was even, although everything inside was trembling. Of course. He smiled again and kissed her as if she was his doll. You have until tomorrow. But remember, some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. When he left, Emily took out her phone and dialed a number that she hadn't used for many years. Jim? It's Emily Caulfield. Remember you said you were always ready to help? I need advice on publishing special data. Old connections are like anchor chains. They rust over time, but in a critical moment, they can keep a ship from crashing. In the evening, looking out the lighthouse window at the lights of the research vessel in the bay, she made a decision. The truth was like that lighthouse, its light could burn, but it was what guided lost ships home. Robert found her in the lab after midnight. She was sitting at the computer, methodically copying files. They're here, she said, without turning around. An ancient species, living proof that these waters need to be protected. And I'm going to use that proof. It's dangerous. You can expect anything from that jerk. I know. That's why I'm going to play their game. Let them think they bought me. It'll give us time. And besides, I have another ace in the hole against Bright. A very strong one. Robert put his hand on her shoulder, not forcefully, like Bright, but gently, like a person ready to support any decision she made. I don't know what you're scheming, but I know we can handle this, he said. Together. Chapter 6. Storm. Old sailors say that a real storm always comes suddenly, even if you've been waiting for it for weeks. That morning, Robert Caulfield realized that they were right. The sky darkened in a matter of minutes, as if someone up there had decided to switch off the lights. The waves, which had been barely visible, were rising higher and higher, and the wind was picking up at an alarming speed. Nature knows how to choose the right moment. As if it too had decided to intervene in this story, to dot all the I's. The Pacific Maritime Holdings research vessel appeared in the bay at dawn, a huge dark mass against the backdrop of leaden clouds. Marine Explorer read the inscription on the side, but Robert knew that the name was as fake as James Bright's scientific degrees. Have they completely lost their minds? Margaret stood next to her son on the lighthouse observation deck, watching the ship try to secure itself at anchor. Even fishermen don't go out to sea in weather like this. They're in a hurry. Robert brought his binoculars to his eyes. See the equipment on deck? It's not for research. They're going to start a test drilling for the foundation of the port. On the deck of the Marine Explorer, people who looked like ants were scurrying around. A huge drill was swaying on a crane, ready to be lowered. Bright was standing on the bridge next to a man in a business suit, ridiculous in the middle of this maritime chaos. Some people never understand the sea. They think they can conquer it with technology and money, forgetting that the ocean existed long before them and will outlive them all. The first gust of the storm wind hit the side of the vessel so hard that it noticeably listed. Waves were washing over the deck, washing away any unsecured equipment. Robert! Emily ran onto the platform, breathless from the quick climb up the stairs. I just got data from the weather station. This isn't just a storm. It could be the strongest hurricane in the last 50 years. As if confirming her words, a new gust of wind hit the walls of the lighthouse, making it tremble slightly. Down below in the bay, the Marine Explorer was desperately trying to stay in place, but the anchor chains were creaking with tension. The radio came alive with a raspy, interference-ridden voice. Blue Point Lighthouse, come in. This is the Marine Explorer. We have engine trouble. I repeat, engine trouble. Robert grabbed the microphone. Understood. What is your situation? Main engine stalled. Backup won't start. Anchor chains may not hold. Dangerous cargo on board. Blast it! The connection was cut off. Panic broke out on the deck of the ship. People were darting around trying to secure loose equipment. Bright was yelling something into a megaphone, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the elements. Dangerous cargo? Margaret paled. Robert, if they mean what I think they mean, fuel for test drilling, he finished. Tons of chemicals and oil. If the ship crashes on the reefs, everything living in the bay will die, Emily whispered. The whales. Robert was already heading down the stairs, limping more than usual. The old wound always made itself known in such weather. Where are you going? Emily called out. To the rescue boat. They're idiots, but we can't let them sink all their junk here. I'm coming with you. No, yes. Her voice was as steely as before when she decided to play a double game with Bright. I know this bay as well as you do, and I have equipment for contacting the Coast Guard. Margaret silently handed them both life jackets. She knew that arguing was useless. Stubbornness was a family trait of the Caulfields. The rescue boat was rocking at the dock like an untamed horse. Getting on board was already a feat. The waves were throwing it from side to side, threatening to smash it against the pilings. From the Marine Explorer, sounds of a siren could now be heard. In the gaps between the waves, you could see people hurriedly putting on life jackets. Bright was running around the bridge, grabbing the radio and yelling something to the man in the suit, who was now sitting on the floor, deathly pale. Hang on, Robert yelled, steering the boat towards the distressed ship. A new wave lifted them up, and for a moment they saw the whole picture. The Marine Explorer, listing to starboard, the ripped drilling equipment swaying on a crane like a pendulum, and the dark silhouettes of the reefs, getting closer and closer to the ship's hull. At sea, seconds stretch into eternity, especially those seconds when you realize everything is about to change forever. The first impact of the hull against the reef sounded like a gunshot. The second, like an explosion. The ship shuddered, and Bright's cry came from the bridge. Open the cargo hatch or we'll all go down. Lighten the load. That's an order. Emily went pale. My God, no. They wouldn't. Robert saw several men rush to the cargo hatch. If they opened it now, all the toxic cargo would spill directly into the bay. Faster! Emily shouted, gripping the handrails. Robert, faster! The boat soared on another wave, and they saw a real fight break out on the deck of the Marine Explorer. Some crew members were trying to prevent the cargo hatch from being opened, while Bright was yelling something at them through a megaphone. The waves threw their small boat around like a chip of wood, but Robert stubbornly pushed it forward. 15 years in the Navy had taught him one thing. Sometimes the only way to survive a storm was to face it head-on. Chapter 7, Battle. There are moments when time slows down to a viscous molasses, and each second stretches into eternity. For Robert Caulfield, that moment arrived when their rescue boat approached the side of the Marine Explorer. The huge hull of the ship loomed over them like a black wall. Water was lashing the deck, and somewhere up above, Bright's people were trying to open the cargo hatch with the toxic materials. At sea, a person either becomes a hero or dies. There is no third option. Robert had known that since the war, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Rope ladder! He roared over the roar of the storm. A storm ladder was thrown down from the ship, swaying like a pendulum above the raging waves. I'm going first, Emily shouted, grabbing the wet ropes. Her backpack contained a waterproof camera. She understood. They would need evidence. Later, she would wonder at her own bravery. But at that moment, fear seemed like something distant and unreal, like a dream from last night. Climbing onto the deck was like ascending into hell. The wind was throwing them from side to side. The waves were drenching them with icy water, and the ship beneath them was groaning and shuddering from the impacts against the reefs. Robert was the last one to climb up, wincing at the pain in his shot-up leg. Chaos reigned on the deck. Some of the crew were trying to secure loose equipment, others were preparing lifeboats. A real fight was underway at the entrance to the cargo hatch. Some sailors were grappling with the people in suits from Pacific Maritime Holdings. "Stop!" Bright's voice echoed over the deck through the megaphone. "That's an order. Open the damned hatch or we'll all go down." He was standing on the bridge, no longer as polished and confident as usual. The wind had tousled his perfect hairstyle. His expensive suit was soaked to the bone, and panic was splashing around in his eyes. "If you do that, everything living in the bay will die for decades," Emily shouted, making her way to the cargo hatch. She had already pulled out her camera and was filming what was happening. "Shut her up." Bright pointed her out to two of his men. "Get that crazy woman out of here. And take away the camera." Robert lunged forward to intercept them, but one of the crew members, a young guy with a dolphin tattoo on his neck, got there before him. "Don't touch her," the sailor yelled. "Captain, they want to kill the bay. These vermin are ready to destroy everything." The ship's real captain, a gray-haired man with a weathered face, hesitated. On the one hand, his ship was in danger. On the other, 15 years at sea had taught him to respect the ocean. "Mr. Bright," he began, but didn't manage to finish. Bright pulled out a gun. At that moment, a new wave hit the side of the ship, and everyone on deck fell like bowling pins. Robert saw his chance. Years of military training kicked in automatically. A roll, a sweep of the leg, and the gun went overboard. Bright snarled and lunged at him, aiming a fist at his face. Fighting on a rocking deck is a dance with death. One wrong step, one inaccurate move, and the ocean will claim another victim. They grappled near the edge of the deck. Bright was fighting desperately, like a cornered animal. At some point, his hand found a piece of pipe, and he swung it. "Robert!" Emily's scream was drowned out by the roar of the storm. The blow was glancing. His military training didn't fail him. Robert grabbed Bright's arm and twisted it behind his back. The pipe clattered across the deck. "Listen, everyone." Emily's voice echoed over the deck. She was holding her phone like a weapon. "I'm live streaming. Everything is being recorded and sent online. Everyone will be held accountable for their actions and decisions. The Coast Guard is already on its way." Bright slumped in Robert's grasp. His refined face was twisted with fury and fear. "You don't understand," he hissed. "You all don't understand. This is a multi-billion-dollar project. They'll destroy me like you wanted to destroy the bay?" Robert twisted his arm harder. "Like you destroyed other nature reserves?" At that moment, the roar of a helicopter engine swept over the deck. The Coast Guard had arrived just in time. The ship was listing even more, threatening to capsize. "Everyone prepare for evacuation." A voice from the loudspeaker cut through the roar of the storm. "I repeat, everyone prepare for evacuation." Emily continued to film as people climbed aboard the rescue helicopter. She filmed as Bright was led away in handcuffs, as the captain saluted his sinking ship, as the young sailor with the dolphin tattoo helped an elderly mechanic into the rescue basket. Robert and Emily were the last to board the helicopter. Below, the Marine Explorer continued to struggle against the waves, but now its cargo hatch was securely sealed, and the toxic cargo remained safe. They managed to see the silver backs of whales flash in a gap between the waves. The ancient species was going into the depths, fleeing from the storm. Emily squeezed the camera tighter. Now she had all the evidence, both Bright's attempts to destroy the bay and the existence of the rare whales. "We did it," she whispered, looking at her husband. Robert nodded silently, holding his shot-up thigh. The victory had not been easy, but it was worth it. Chapter 8 Dawn. After a storm, there is always calm. This is a law of nature, as immutable as the tides. But sometimes the calm can be deceptive, especially when it's not about the weather, but about human passions and corporate intrigues. Some battles don't end when the wind dies down. They just move to another level where instead of waves and wind, there are paragraphs of laws and newspaper headlines. A week had passed since the dramatic rescue of the crew of the Marine Explorer. The wreckage of the ship was still visible on the reefs, a silent reminder of how close they had been to disaster. The cargo hatch, fortunately, had remained intact, and a special team of ecologists was working on the safe extraction of the toxic materials. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, newspapers spread out before her. Pacific Maritime Holdings under investigation. One headline read, "Environmental Scandal of the Year. Attempt to destroy a unique marine ecosystem." Another one screamed, "They've offered a settlement," she said when Robert came down for breakfast. "They want to hush up the matter." "And what did you tell them?" Robert poured himself some coffee. His limp was more noticeable after the events on the ship, but there was a new gleam in his eyes. "The same thing I've told all my opponents in 30 years of legal practice," Margaret smiled. "That the truth is not for sale." In the lab by the dock, Emily was finishing work on her article. Her discovery had caused a bombshell effect in the scientific community. The rarest species of whale, thought to be extinct, not only existed, but had found refuge precisely in the waters that the corporation had planned to destroy. "You know," she said to Robert when he came in, "James was right about one thing. It really did change everything. Just not the way he planned it. The irony of fate. Sometimes our worst enemies become involuntary helpers in achieving our goals." The news kept coming in one after another. James Bright had testified against his employers, hoping for a lighter sentence. His confessions, together with Emily's video recordings and Margaret's documents, created an irrefutable body of evidence. Federal investigation into Pacific Maritime Holdings expands. Margaret read aloud another headline. "Facts of bribery of officials and falsification of environmental assessments revealed." And then came the main news. The waters around Blue Point Island were given the status of a marine reserve. A special role in this was played not only by the whales that had been found, but also by the testimony of the young sailor with the dolphin tattoo. His testimony about Bright's attempt to dump toxic substances into the ocean was the final nail in the coffin of the corporation's plans. In the evening, they gathered on the lighthouse observation deck. The sun was setting in the ocean, painting the water in gold and crimson tones. Somewhere in the distance, whale fountains appeared. The family of ancient giants was returning to their native waters. "You know," Emily snuggled up to her husband's shoulder, "when I first met James, he talked about progress, about how important it was to move forward. But he didn't understand the main thing." "What was that?" "That sometimes progress is about leaving something untouched, preserving what nature created." Margaret came onto the deck, carrying a tray with cups of hot tea. The three of them stood there, watching as the last rays of the sun painted the sky and the lighthouse began its night watch. "I talked to the publisher," Emily said after a long silence. "They want me to write a book, not only about whales but about all this, about how greed almost destroyed a unique ecosystem, and how a handful of people managed to prevent it." "Write it!" Robert hugged her tighter. "People need to know." Below, in the bay, the whales began their evening song. Their voices, ancient as the ocean itself, carried over the water, as if reminding everyone that there are things that cannot be measured in money, things worth fighting for. The lighthouse continued to send its light into the darkness, guiding ships and protecting the peace of the marine giants. Its beam was like an outstretched helping hand to everyone who needed it, whether it was a lost ship or an ancient whale looking for its way home. And in the detention cell, James Bright looked through the barred window at the distant light of the lighthouse and thought about how one wrong decision could change your entire life. Ahead of him was a trial and many years of imprisonment, but it was a just punishment for trying to destroy something invaluable for corporate profit. The only small black spot of soot on the snow-white sheet of this story remained Emily's little secret about that night with Bright on the boat. She reproached herself for that momentary weakness, but decided that sometimes a small lie to save something bigger, for the greater good. If you like this story, please support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.